So I'm going to talk more about early patterns, but I'm going to focus on the development of reaching, and I'm going to try to tell the story that the origin of reaching is actually embodied and not visually guided. So reaching actually it's a very special moment in the infant life because this is the first time that vision directed to an object is actually also meeting an action also directed to that same object. This is an important transition because early transition in early infant life because once they start to reach those objects that they were mainly looking at, now they can actually explore them and they can touch them, they can actually learn a lot of features. And we know that reaching also has a lot of impact on future development. It triggers a cascade of behavior. So when they start to reach for object, not only they discover the feature of the object, their texture, their shape, their sound, and so on, but it will also influence their social exchange with their caregiver, and it will open the way to a bunch of other more sophisticated behaviors, such as tool use, for example. So reaching, because of those reasons, it's been studied for a very long time. Actually, if you look at the history of the study of reaching, it's nearly 9 decades of studies on reaching. And one of the first person that provided actually very detailed description of the development of reaching was Jean Piaget, when he observed his children and when they started to do the behavior. He was one of the first to say that reaching, in order to emerge, it needs the coordination of vision and action. And he also was at the origin of one of the longest held assumption that for learning to reach, infants need to learn to guide their hand to the target. So they need to look at their hand, they need to look at the target, and step by step, they need to bring their hand in contact. And this view was heralded by a number of people who actually followed in the steps of Piaget. If you look at the textbook on motor development, you can also see that this view is still very strongly present. A lot of textbooks present the development of reaching as a 2-phase process. An early phase around 4 and 8 months when reaching emerges, which is actually marked by a lot of this continuous trajectory of the hand to the target. A lot of studies who have done kinematic measurement of those actually find that this is a very robust result. Those infants don't bring their hand straight to the target. It actually shows us very, very tortuous trajectory as they get there. But then at the end, the second part of the first year, there is a change where those trajectories become more straightforward. And usually this period is called visually elicited as opposed to visually guided. And this is assumed that visual-manual coordination is actually formed here. It's put together, and there is no need to monitor the hand anymore. But do infants truly look at their hand when they're reaching? I've studied infant reaching for years now, and I've seen a lot of babies at the onset, on the brink of learning to reach, and I want to show you how it looks like. Hopefully I can get this going. This is a study that was done by my former graduate student, Josh Williams. This baby is a week shy from 3 months old. It's very hard. They don't give up. They try very hard, and you can see this is a 1-minute recording, and the whole time is fixating on the target, and once the object comes into reach, they start to move their hand. But they have no idea how to bring their hand up there. So this is very typical. I mean, I'm showing you one infant, but I can show you tons of videos like that. So they really stare at the target. They never look at their hand or arms. And you can see that here it looks like vision in action are really not coordinated. They have no idea. They see the object, but they have no idea to bring their hand there. So how does it happen when they start to do it? What happens? So let me show you, this is a different study also that Josh Williams did. This was actually a different version of the sticky mitten paradigm. If some of you are familiar with that, there is a researcher who actually fitted Velcro mitten on baby's hand And so that's why you see that wrapping around the hand of the baby, and there is Velcro on the toy, and so if they happen to hit the toy, the Velcro stick to the toy, and that's supposed to simulate grasping, right? So you will see when this baby hits the toy, and you'll see the toy moving. So it happens very quickly. But some of the same feature, you'll see this baby staring at the target, the hands are moving, it's even protruding its tongue here, and boom, it happens. But it really doesn't look that really planned movement. It really looks like it happens by chance, suddenly, surprise, oops, I hit the toy. So there is no real visual guidance of the hand here too. No look at the hand, and again, the contact seems to happen by chance, the first time. But this doesn't happen by chance for very long. So Josh has followed those babies for 16 days intervention. So he actually followed those babies days by days for 16 days from the first day. These are actually the two studies I showed you those videos from. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I don't want to go over time, but the bottom line here is that on day first, they're not hitting the target at all. But if you see over the 16 days, you have a very rapid progression. Those babies, once they do it once, they figure out how to do it more and more and more and more repeatedly. Without going into the detail of the study, what we learned about those two studies is that actually vision is not, again, guiding this progress. It looked at the vision, and the amount of looking at the toy is very dismal in those studies. But what we learned is that the haptic feedback of touching the toy and the contingent reinforcement that he actually studied particularly in these studies seem to be the more significant factor that are driving those babies to figure out how to bring their hand there. It's not visual guidance. So from everything I told you so far, we know that infants, when they get ready to reach, they actually look straight at the target. They do not look at their hand to figure out how to guide the hand to the desired target location. And once they begin to make contact, even if it happens by chance the first time, that chance event is sufficient to trigger another trial and error until they actually figure it out very quickly. So this has led other researchers to actually really consider visually guided as a myth. And that's actually basically the term that Clifton and al. Have used in 1993 in a study where they followed infants longitudinally. So these were infants that were not able to reach. She followed them over time until the onset of reaching. She had two groups of infants. One were tested in ambient light, so they could see the object, they could see their hand. And then she had another group, they were tested in the dark. So they would see the object glowing in the dark, but they would not be able to see their hands. And what they found that the two groups actually started to reach at about the same time. The group that was tested in the dark was not delayed in their onset of reaching. And so that led them again to conclude that, vision of the hand is not really a significant factor in learning to reach. And a study we did with astathinan at about the same time, we were looking at trajectory formation in those young infants. We found that those distortions in the trajectory are not due to visual control or monitoring of the hand. Often those babies, when they start to reach, they move too fast. When they move too fast, they generate a lot of motion-dependent forces or torques that actually tends to drag their hand away from the intended trajectory. And so those corrections are really trying to damp down those forces to try to bring their hand in contact with the target. So there is no visual guidance here. So the question is, what is the role of vision in learning to reach? Because those babies are staring at those toys. They really are intensely looking at those toys. And how the coordination between vision and action forms. So this is what got us to start to do eye tracking studies with those babies. We wanted to know where they look, how that maps onto their motor behavior. And I'm going to show you some of those first results that we're getting. But before I go to the infants, I want to establish a baseline and show you an adult recording that we've done in the lab, just to have a sense of how do adults do this. And we use the paradigm that we use with the infants. So we ask the adult to look at the object for 5 seconds, then they hear a go signal, and the hand, when the go signal goes, they actually reach for the object. You won't hear the go signal, the video is silent, but you'll figure it out pretty quickly looking at this. So the dot is where the gaze is located on the scene. So the go signal just happened. And you can see here, look at the right, middle, go signal, go to the left, reach to the left. Look on top, middle, down, reach down. Okay, so what you see here is that when the go signal occurs, there is a cursory glance to a specific area of the object in anticipation of hand-object contact. And what is also very striking in this video is that you really have a precise match between the object area that is last looked and where the hand is brought. And this is actually a very strong feature that has been also documented by a number of studies. Now, there are a lot of studies on eye tracking that are coming up, and they're all different, but they all have that common denominator. The vision actually goes there first. That's actually the definition of visual elicited reach. And then the hand follows and goes where we look, right?
So, Daniela, question. So there's nothing about the characteristics of the object that determine where they grasp it?
For adult, there is. I mean, the cup, you can see it went to the handle. It actually
is. Doesn't that correspond with when it goes, if the go signals at a different point, do they not reach there?
So you can vary the task, okay? But I mean, the idea here, this is a natural task. You ask them to reach for a cup, you don't give instruction. They look at the cup, they look at the wording on the cup, and then when they hear the go signal, the eye goes to the handle and they grab the handle. It's a cup. I mean, adults are trained to grab cups by the hand, so you have the history that builds up in there as well. So, but the point I want to make here is that, you know, vision sort of selects ahead of the action, okay? So the question is, how do infants do this? We started by looking at the transition of reaching because this is really where we were really curious to see how this visual manual coordination comes about. And we have a study published with 3 infants. We are collecting more data to substantiate this data. I realize 3 infants is not always convincing, but you will see the coherence in those 3 infants is quite outstanding. And it's very hard to see such coherent data in infants given the variability you get in the response. But what we did here, so we did this eye tracking paradigm where we followed those infants. So I'll show you data 5 weeks before the onset of reaching, where we'll see the looking behavior on the object, what happened at reach onset, and then what happens 5 weeks after once they began to reach. And clearly, again, the questions here were to try to figure out how coordination between vision and arm occurs prior to, at, and after reach onset. And we wanted to see if the intense staring at the object that we see is somewhat entraining the hand to the target, and if so, do we see a spatial match between the looking and the reaching as we saw in the adults. Let me give you a few details about the object that we designed because that's important. So these were all made up objects except for the little cups that were part of little tea sets for kids. They're all unique, solid colors, no details. If you do eye tracking, you learn quickly that any little detail will completely affect the way you look at things. So we really wanted those infants to focus on the shape of the object. So we remove any distractor that could actually drive their looking pattern elsewhere. But the other important feature is that those objects are fairly large, and that's important. So 15 centimeter, we wanted to give room to those infants to scan those objects freely. And we wanted to see if there would be a selection process, a visual selection process that would happen. Would there be, just plain distributed looking, or is there an area that will fixate more and pay attention more? And if that happens, that area they focus more, they would select, is that the area they're going to touch? So if they reach for those objects as well, because they're large, they have choices, right? They can reach here, they can reach here, their hands are tiny, so they have a lot of choices on where to grab that object as well. So the question was to open degrees of freedom, see how exploration visually actually builds up, and actually if it leads to any decision making in the reaching pattern. Just a quick explanation of how we did this. We built a black theater that has a window in which we could fit a monitor screen for the calibration. You can see this was done with actually an old eye tracker, a Tobii X50. Once the calibration is done, we can swivel out the monitor. We close curtain, and we are ready for collecting data. We also collected kinematics for the reaching. I'm not going to talk about that today. But once the curtain opened, the infant would see the object presented by an experimenter. They only see the hand. There is another black curtain behind that is actually concealing the experimenter. So they see the hand holding this object for about 5 or 7 seconds. Again, we're trying to get tracking and looking at this object, and then it was moved slowly in the infant reaching space. And again, we had all our system were actually synchronized through a system of diodes and timers, so we could actually reconstruct and put together all the sources, kinematics, eye tracking, video, together to reconstruct the scene. So these are just examples of gaze plots that we got, just to give you an idea of what we saw. This is a gaze plot at the week -5. This is week -1 before reach onset. This is week +1 and week +5 after reach onset. And when you see in those gaze plots, so those dots here, these are the fixation that you see. There is actually a progressive shift from a fixation to the center or the center and sphere to actually to the sphere. At this point, you have a lot of looking at the sphere. You can see all those fixation are here, those black points, but there is very few elsewhere on the scene. And this is pretty much what we saw in the data in the looking behavior. To analyze the data, we divided the object in 3 areas of interest, and we looked at the accumulated looking duration in each of those areas. So we can actually look at the period where they look more at the sphere as opposed to the rod and so on. Okay. So let me tell you about the findings. I'm going to walk you through this data step by step because they're a little complicated. So these are the 3 infants, and I'm going to start telling you about the looking only. So we're going to talk about reaching afterwards. And the scale that you have here, it's a little small, but we have the 5 weeks before reach onset back here. Reach onset is at the 0 point here, and then we have the 5 weeks after reach onset. And so these are the 3 toy division with the accumulated looking duration at each one of those areas. So the dark brown is the sphere, the ochre middle rod, and the light green is the end of the rod. And what I put here also is data from 9-month-old infant that we collected in the exact same setup as a 5-second waiting that we put in there because we were curious to see how those early reachers would compare to older infants who are already part of the visually elicited period, right? So we did analysis by taking those data in periods. So we looked at the pre-reaching period. We ran a Friedman to see if the distribution were different. They're different for 2 babies. 1 baby, we had a lot of missing data, so we couldn't really run the task. But you can see that this top baby here was looking mostly at the middle of the sphere. This one was focusing mostly at the middle. Those were significantly different. When you look at after reaching, we also have different distribution in those 3 areas of looking. Clearly, there is very little looking at the end of the rod, and those distribution here, when we do pairwise, actually we do find differences, and the looking, as you can see, is actually getting more and more toward the sphere. We run some tests to look at the developmental trend, and I'm showing you the only one we found significant. From reach onset, we find an increase of looking at the sphere, so they look more and more at the sphere of the object, and there is a decrease in the look at the middle rod. And that was very consistent for the 3 babies. Okay, so when you see this pattern in a scene that vision is visually guiding, what happened to reaching? You would predict, well, if I look more at the sphere, maybe those babies learn to reach more to the sphere as a function of time, right? Well, that's not exactly what we found. We kind of found that, but not exactly. So this is how the reaching data look like. What we found is that those babies were reaching at the sphere from the first time they start to reach more than they reach to the other area. And what's really astounding about this data is that that object was not always presented in this direction. We always alternated the direction. So they always aimed at the sphere regardless of where it was in relation to the rod. And that was significantly different. So those distributions are significantly different. We didn't find many developmental trend. The only one that showed up was for this baby here. But all those shows no significant developmental trend. So how do these data compare to the 9-month-old? To do the analysis with the 9-month-old, we again took chunk of that data. So we look at a 3-week chunk before reach onset, 3-week chunks around before reach onset, around reach onset, and what happens, after reach onset. And this is what we found for the looking pattern. Prior to reach onset, those infants' looking pattern were different from the 9-month-old. At reach onset, they were still significantly different from the 9-month-old. But post reach onset, those patterns, they were no more significantly different from the 9-month-old. And if you look at those patterns, the 9-month-old, they look a lot at the sphere, and by after 5 weeks of reaching, those babies looked at the sphere just like 9-month-old do. That was a complete surprise. We were not expecting that. And in reaching, they're not different either. I mean, we didn't find any difference. You can see the 9-month-old are also reaching and touching first the sphere, just like the other babies are doing. That's really amazing data when we were just blown up when we saw this result. But it's not always like that. Infants also, they're very messy participants. If you actually do the task with this other object, just to show you here, we actually found nothing here. And so here it seems that having a point of focus like the sphere that is maybe more salient or attract looking more may have some role in the organizational process of reaching. That's what we think. We need to do more study to understand that. But the plain rod consistently trust study is kind of a boring object. It doesn't really have distinct part. And you can see that now reaching and looking don't really organize very well in this case. You have more random pattern of responses. And I just want to note also that the 9-month-old here are very distributed looking as well for that object. So the next question we were interested in finding was the match, the precise match, right? If the babies are looking here and they're reaching here, we call this a match. But if the baby were looking here and reached here, that was not a match. And we did that matching trial by trial, okay? And this is what we see as a function of the 5 weeks from reach onset. We found for the sphere that there was a really rapid increase in matching between reaching and looking, but remember, the match was not by adjusting the reach to the sphere. They were reaching already to the sphere. The match was actually to adjusting vision to the sphere. They were looking increasingly more to the sphere. It's almost as if the reaching was guiding vision to the sphere and not vision guiding reaching, okay? And this baby didn't show significant because it had a high match, but if this point, you remove that point, you have the same trend. And again, for the rod, we had a little bit of everything. The other surprising thing is by 5 weeks, the rate of matching of those babies was actually similar to the rate of matching in the 9-month-old. Okay, so what do we do with this data? We're still kind of scratching our head around to figure out exactly how to explain this data, but this is what we think is going on right now. We think that babies acquire a body-centered sense of movement direction to their limb in the months before they begin to reach. So they really learn about their body and their arm movements. This is what we call the embodied origin of infant reaching. So when reaching emerges, infant actually, what the data suggests is that babies are mapping their looking behavior to the feel of their movement because they have more experience about the feel of their movement than maybe vision that is not really goal-directed at the time. So I'll get back to this point a little later. But when I'll elaborate on that a bit later. But what we wanted to do is also to look at more closely at what those older babies are doing. So we look at 9-month-old to see if the pattern of visual motor mapping would be more established. And we came up with a new setup, a new paradigm, where now we can do the eye tracking with the object in reach. So there is no 5-second wait period here. We calibrate right here in the window. And this was actually another study that Emily McMahon did, and Rebecca Wiener is one of my graduate students. So she hides the object behind that occluder. When the tracker is started, she has feedback here. And when she knows that she gets signal from the eye tracker, she lowers the object. Here we have a plate, but she also has a condition where there is no plate. It's just the hand holding the object there, and the infant can reach anytime they want. And often it happens very quickly. So let me show you a trial from this setup. You see the reach actually happens on the right part. So the baby looks at the object. And then you see the hand goes to the right, and the eye goes to the right, and the hand goes to the right, and we have very much a precise match here. Let me give you just another example. So this one, there is only look there, and the hand goes there. So you really, again, have a precise match. But we also saw a certain number of no matches, and here is just one example. The baby looks on the right and goes and reach where actually there was never fixation there. They never looked at the area they contacted. So we defined 4 strategies. One we call the targeted look. This is a strategy where the infant looks first, so the reach has not started. You can see the hands are still here, and then the hand goes and reaches exactly where the eye was. We have a catch-up look where the hand actually starts before the eye is actually in the contact area. So in this case, the eye is looking here, the hand is already on its way to reach, the contact occurs here, and the eye just catches up with the movement as the infant is going there. And usually the eye and hand either arrive at the same time on the same points, or the eye is just, just a few milliseconds before the hand. Then we have a trailing look, where in fact contact occurs before the eye is there, but the eye then just comes afterwards. So here the hand is already touching the object, but the eye comes just shortly after. And then we have the untargeted look, which is the one I showed you on the video, where the baby reaches, but there are no fixation in the area where they make contact. So what do we find in terms of those 4 strategies? What are the distribution? We found very little trailing, which accounts for the only main effect that we observed. But if you look at the targeted here, the catch-up or the untargeted, there is no difference. There is no one strategy that predominates. They really do this randomly. There is no learning effect. We looked at trial by trial. There's just random. Sometimes they do it this way. Sometimes they do it that way. There is no consistent pattern of visual manual coordination here. It's elicited, yes. But in terms of organizing the eye and the hand, it seems that they have all kinds of different ways of doing this. And we found a few effects when we did the analysis by object. For the dumbbell, you can see there is a little less targeted responses. It's significant difference from the rods. For the catch-up, we have a little bit more in this object than we have in the other ones. So it seems that even at 9 months old of age, when arm trajectory are more stable, infants do not seem to produce a consistent spatial loop-reach match as we see in adults. But for now, we still have a lot of work to do. We need to look at other ages, and we're planning to do that. But for now, we are tempted to conclude that up to 9 months of age, at least, that's how far we went, infant may use vision to provide a rough location of the object in space. But for producing the reach and movement itself, they may be relying more on their strong sense of body link position in their peripersonal space. That's what we think might be happening. This interpretation is actually consistent with other studies in the literature. Clifton et al. Did another study in '91 where they actually had babies reaching in the dark for objects that were not seen but sounding. So there was actually no visual information, but just localization information in space by sound. And those infants at 6.5 months, they would hit the target. So again, vision doesn't seem to be. To do that, you need to have a good proprioceptive sense of where to project your arm in space. And some other study from Carrico and Berthier have suggested that when vision really starts to take over in the way that it seems to be often the case in adults, seems to start in the 2nd year of life. So this whole 1st year, they seem to be, the role of vision may not be the most predominant. So what does this tell us about the implication for the development of eye-hand coordination? So again, I want to stress that the reach onset corresponds to the first time in the infant life where vision and action intersect, not by chance, but actually with a common aim. So those babies are staring at the toy they wanted, and they're trying to bring their hand there, right? But before then, if you look at the history before that moment arrives, those infants clearly have experience at seeing the world. I mean, they look at things in their environment. They have experience at moving their limbs. But their proprioceptive and visual experiences, I don't think they are really calibrated to one another. What they get, they try to calibrate 2 sensory experiences that provide very different dimension of space. The vision is actually provides a lot of information in the distance, far away. The proprioceptive is actually limited to the peripersonal space. When you reach, those 2 spaces need to come together. And I think what they're trying to do, at least what our data suggests for now, is that they may be trying to calibrate their visual space to their peripersonal space. That would be the interpretation that we think might be happening. And so what they do when they're learning to reach, they're learning to map their sight onto the field of their arms. 1 minute. Okay. I just wanted to give you a sneak preview of what we are trying to do now. So, I mean, this generated a lot of questions. As I said already, we have a lot of data. We're putting together now to substantiate this data. We're collecting more data. But we got curious about what happens before reach onset. So, I want to know, do infants look at their hand in months prior to reaching? Is there any evidence of that? Do they explore their body and peripersonal space? Where do they move their hand? Where do they keep their hand before they reach? And are they insensitive to objects in the visual fields? So we got some seed money to actually start to follow babies from 3 to 20 weeks old. They come in the lab every week. And we do recording of their spontaneous activity. So we have 5-minute recording of a baseline, toys in view, a sounding toy but out of view, a mom talking in a mobile condition that's pictured right here. We record kinematics. And we calibrate the space so we kind of have a sense of where the hands are. We can tell if they move faster, if there is change in the movement as a function of those conditions. But what we do also, we're trying to map the self-touch. This is just one example of coding from a 4 weeks old for 5-minute baseline. And all those little red dots you see is where the touch occurs on the body. So you can see here the left hand was flexed and touched the left shoulder. The right hand actually touched a lot the right chin and part of the head or part of the back of the head. Here are contacts with the feet touching the legs. And this one actually the contact on the mat, on the floor when they're touching the surface. And so we're hoping with this to be able to map the touched area, how they discover their body, how do they keep their arm, where do they move them, what are kind of speed of movement they generate. That could actually provide us hopefully some insight as to their prior experience before the onset of reaching. So this work clearly required a lot of help from a lot of students. These are my graduate student, prior and current. She was an undergraduate student who did the study in REACH, and a lot of undergraduate students who are clearly also helping us with this work. Thank you very much.